Good afternoon, good morning, or good night, everyone. First, I'd like to, on behalf of the organizers of this event, to thank you very much for accepting the invitation to participate in the conversation today. It is a very exciting, I hope it's going to be a very exciting session. I would like to, on my own behalf, thank the Responsible Mining Foundation, the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, Pact, the University of Delaware, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network for inviting me to facilitate the conversations today. So the topic of our webinar is self-explanatory. I mean, the title says it all. Mining and SDGs, leveraging artisanal small-scale mining and large-scale mining to help achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. For us to be able to have a proper conversation, that always encourage everyone to have your mics switched off, so that we avoid sound interferences. The same applies to video. So if you have questions, please use the chat functions to ask your questions. Because we are 1,000 or so participants, we might not be able, use the Q&A function instead of the chat function. Because we have about 1,000 plus participants, we might not be able to respond to all the questions, but we encourage you to nevertheless to ask them. We'll pick a selected few to enable our presenters today to offer some insights about it. So the session, as you can see from the program on the screen, comprises of two main blocks. One where we will have discussion on artisanal small-scale mining and its interface with the SDGs. This will be informed by a study that the University of Delaware and Pact led. So, and we'll have the speakers lined up for that. Jorden, the Haan will be the main speaker, and we'll have also perspectives offered by James, Kirsten Dales, and Mohammed Abdullahi Kamara. And then this will be followed by another important conversation on large-scale mining and the SDGs, where we will be having representatives of the Responsible Mining Foundation and of Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, as well as from the University of Cape Town. So we'll have Mrs. Hélène de Villiers-Piaget, Perrine Toledano, and Brian Chickson to take us through this particular segment. And then the last segment is going to be about the LSM and ASM linkages. So what is the kind of interfaces that we can sort of foster with a view to accelerating the achievement of the SDGs. So that's basically the program. We will now go through the introduction, and I'm very pleased to invite Dr. Julie Klinger from the University of Delaware to address us with their welcome words. So, Julie, the floor is yours.
Good. Thank you very much, Antonio Pedro, and greetings to everyone tuning in from all over the world. On behalf of the University of Delaware, we're proud to be a partner in producing this important report on mining and sustainable development goals. So the University of Delaware, of course, is proud to partner with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, Pact, the Responsible Mining Foundation, and the many researchers, policymakers, firms, NGOs, and universities engaged in this crucial question of mining and sustainable development. The University of Delaware is a land, sea, and space grant university which advances global research on resources, development, and the environment, and provides a graduate and professional certificate program on minerals, materials, and society. So the Minerals, Material, and Society program was founded by United Nations International Resources Panel member and University of Delaware professor, Dr. Salim Ali. And this program is available to students and also to mid-career professionals, with many online course offerings to make it accessible around the world. The program is designed to address the growing need for greater capacity to understand and reconcile the complex relationships between mineral extraction, materials production, and our diverse societal needs. I know from my own research on rare earth mining around the world, as well as my collaboration with indigenous communities in the Amazon rainforest, and my more recent research on space mining, that there is no such thing as sustainable development without socially and environmentally responsible mining. And for this, we need ASM and LSM members fully on board. This report is a milestone on our collective journey to achieve sustainable development. Now, compared to where we were a half a century ago, 30 years ago, we've come a long way. But as we all know, to achieve sustainable development and also to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius over the coming decades, we still have a long way to go. The University of Delaware is proud to partner with you as we address this most pressing issue of our time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the presentation and the important discussion to follow.
Thank you, Dr. Julie. I think Dr. Julie has set the stage for our conversations today. And this conversation is a timely one because, as you know, we are initiating the SDG Decade of Action. And now, after COVID, we will be looking, during COVID, we're still looking at building back better or building forward better, and that all of those transitions are resource intensive. And the big question, therefore, is can we promote these transitions in a sustainable manner? Can we promote sustainable consumption and production? As you know, the quest for mainstreaming sustained development in the extractive industry has been a problem in the sector for many years. In the 90s, through the work of the Global Mining Initiative and the Mining, Minerals, and Sustained Development, we've charted some of the key principles that have informed policy discourse and conversations thereafter. Their seminar report, Breaking New Ground, offers some of those suggestions, which were later picked by many organizations, including the ICMM, and of course, some of the key foundations, the Responsible Mining Foundation. I see this as a continuation of that quest for better mining, that contributes to sustained development. Of course, with the limitations that Julie referred to. And in this particular conversation, artisanal small-scale mining has been always a neglected sector. And yet, for some of the transitions that will be important for the day after COVID, as it were, artisanal small-scale mining contributes a lot in terms of its production. So we will be hearing from Jorden, James, and Kirsten, as well as testimony from Mr. Camara, a presentation on the ASM SDG policy assessment, for which, without further ado, I would like to invite Jorden to take the floor. Jorden, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Pedro. I hope you can all see my screen and hear me clearly. Thank you, Mr. Pedro, and hi to all participants. Greetings from Nairobi. On behalf of Pact, an international development organization, I would like to thank Mr. Pedro and the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network for co-organizing this event with us, along with the Responsible Mining Foundation, the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investments, and the University of Delaware. Before going into the heart of the matter, I would like to provide you with some background to this publication. As development practitioners, my two co-authors, Kirsten Dales and Dr. James McQuilken, and myself, have long been troubled by the fact that ASM was not yet linked to the 17 SDGs. Since the SDGs play a pivotal role in informing national and regional development frameworks, this lack of association with the SDGs perpetuates the sector's systematic exclusion from such frameworks. As Mr. Pedro already said, the sector has really historically been marginalized, and this lack of association with the SDGs further perpetuates that marginalization and thereby the informality of the sector. But about a year ago, Professor Salim Ali and two colleagues were developing a book on mining and the SDGs, and they invited us to contribute a cross-cutting chapter on ASM. As we started working on this, we soon realized that this topic is so complex that it really merits its own space. And therefore, we decided to publish this as a standalone ASM SDG policy assessment between Pact and the University of Delaware. First, shortly about the methods. Our assessment is based on previous work and a global literature. The assessment draws from an extensive ASM SDG matrix, which considers both positive and negative impacts of ASM on each of the 17 SDGs and their 169 targets. This considers the sector in its current largely informal state, but in order to provide a complete picture, it also considers the impacts that a fully formalized sector can have on the Sustainable Development Goals. So, to give you a glimpse of what we are going to discuss in this presentation, here's an indication of some of our key findings, illustrated in two ASM SDG reels. As will become evident in the next 15 minutes, even in its largely informal state, ASM makes positive contributions to almost all 17 SDGs, but also has negative impacts on most of them. Moreover, as we will see, formalization can really has a great potential in harnessing ASM's impacts on the SDGs. It can help to mitigate many of ASM's negative impacts on the SDGs, and it can help, excuse me, it can amplify ASM's positive impacts on the SDGs. However, naturally, this all depends on the way that formalization is approached. So therefore, before going into our findings, I'd like to briefly give you a bit of a glimpse of the conceptualization of formalization as we have used in this assessment. In this publication, we define ASM formalization as essentially a process of capacity building for enabling compliance with applicable regulations and ultimately facilitating access to formal markets. The assessment builds on the concepts and the key components of the formalization process as they've been introduced in the Formalization Handbook by UNITAR and UN Environment. Now let's go to our findings. As all the 17 SDGs are interrelated, we have organized our analysis into 7 SDG clusters. I will now first discuss the cluster of economic development, and after that, I will pass the floor to Kirsten and James to discuss other SDG clusters. In the cluster of economic development, we discuss SDG 1 on poverty reduction, SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, and SDG 12 on responsible consumption and production. Let us first consider the impacts of the largely informal sector. Starting with SDG 1, ASM provides critical direct livelihoods for more than 42 million people worldwide living in impoverished areas. Moreover, in view of the sector's local spillover effects in rural economies, the sector provides many more indirect livelihoods in rural economies as well. The sector is thus critical for alleviating poverty. And as for SDG 8, the sector sparks local economic growth and provides employment for otherwise unemployed youth. But at the same time, the informal ASM sector is associated with poor labor conditions and poor occupational health and safety conditions as well. So one could pose the question, to what extent this employment really concerns decent work? Regarding SDG 12, ASM's impacts are mainly negative. For example, ASM generally adopts inefficient processing methods, and it pollutes the environment with hazardous chemicals such as mercury and cyanide. Turning to formalization, however, this can really help to harness ASM's impacts on economic development. For example, formalization can help to prevent miners from getting stuck in a so-called poverty cycle by facilitating access to land, mineral resources, technology, training, and finance. Moreover, formalization can help to increase government revenues, for example, through the collection of license fees, taxes, and royalties. Formalization can reduce informal labor and child labor, and it can facilitate the establishment of miners' associations, thereby improving decent work. And finally, I will note that formalization can facilitate the adoption of better mining practices, thereby improving responsible and sustainable mineral production. I will now pass the floor to Kirsten Dales, an industrial ecologist and ASM expert, to discuss social development and environmental stewardship. Over to you, Kirsten.
Thank you, Jorden, and good morning from the west coast of Canada to everyone. My discussion will cover the issues of social development, addressing SDGs related to education, gender, and broader inequalities. Social development is about improving the well-being of every individual in society so that they can reach their full potential. The positive contributions that ASM makes towards social development include that it enables education and often finances school fees in rural areas. It provides opportunities for on-the-job training with potential skills transfer. It also enhances resilience, both at the household and the community level, and can provide a vehicle for empowerment of women and the most vulnerable. Importantly, the sector almost also enhances the well-being of increased incomes, enhances well-being through increased incomes of the bottom 40% worldwide. However, the sector is often viewed in a negative context and is often a source of unease for governments in cases when ASM results in school dropouts for rural youth and children, reducing future opportunities, when women are relegated to secondary or poorly paid roles and excluded from decision-making. And this stems from unequal power relations and prevailing inequalities that manifest in various forms of exploitation and exclusion for minors, their families, and communities. The potential impacts, next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So how can formalization help? Well, the potential impact of formalization has been shown to have a positive influence on reducing child labor and supporting technical vocation education and training opportunities and apprenticeships, as well as scholarships, and can provide a wide range of social, economic, and political benefits through inclusive formalization processes. But as Jorden alluded to, often, if we don't have inclusive processes, we can inadvertently exclude women or various other vulnerable populations. And if top-down approaches are adopted, this really just equates to exclusion. Next slide, please. And covering environmental stewardship, addressing issues of climate, life below water, and life on land. Environmental issues are some of the most obvious, visible, and politicized negative impacts of the ASM sector. These include tropical deforestation and other types of habitat degradation, degradation of land, water, and soil resources, and chemical pollution, habitat degradation and fragmentation resulting in biodiversity loss, destruction of coastal ecosystems, mangroves, estuaries, and beaches, as well as encroachment into protected areas. Many of these issues, however, stem from a lack of land use planning and a separation of the extractive industries from other land uses in the natural resource sector. On the other hand, if we consider ASM production systems, these actually make a positive contribution in terms of supplying the critical metals, materials, and mined materials required for climate action and low carbon energy transitions. Consequently, the ASM sector can help meet the growing demand for clean energy technologies through the production of minerals such as graphite, cobalt, lithium, heavy and light rare earths, which are estimated to increase by 500% by 2050 in terms of their demand. And as well, this can directly support nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement and other climate policies. Next slide, please. And so if we look at the potential opportunities that formalization affords the ASM sector from an environmental perspective, this really can advance climate mitigation for the ASM sector. It can enable the transition to low carbon economies. It can facilitate improved monitoring and enforcement measures, both in terrestrial and marine ecosystems and protected areas, as well as incentivizing mine rehabilitation and safe post-closure mine use. And this ultimately can be achieved through optimizing land use planning, through multi-sectoral approaches that include versus exclude ASM actors, as well as leveraging investments in land, which can accelerate initiatives such as the Bond Challenge and the UN ecosystem, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And with this, I'll invite James McQuilken from Pact's Mine to Market program to look at the issue of nutrition and health. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Kirsten, and hi everyone. Good afternoon from London. The fourth cluster that we grouped the SDGs into was nutrition and healthy lives. And perhaps one of the most clear and positive impacts in this way is the way that artisanal and small-scale mining interlocks with agriculture and other rural livelihood activities. And this interlocking is key, really, because it increases resilience by providing multiple income streams. So, for example, the faster and higher returns from mining can be used to buy seeds, fertilizers, and other farming equipment, which can help secure food production and also enhance nutrition. The presence of miners and mining communities also creates increased demand for local markets, which can benefit farmers who may receive higher prices at the farm gate. However, on the negative side, this can also create inflation of local goods and local food, which makes it more expensive for other members of the community, actually having an adverse impact and undermining nutrition. Other negative impacts as well that we find in the report was the clear conflict often between small-scale mining and farming. And in fact, this picture that you see on the screen is of a farm in Zambia, cabbage farm, that's been destroyed by ASM activities. And it also obviously can destroy water bodies, undermining food production and clean water sources. In terms of occupational health and safety as well, I mean, all mining activity is an inherently dangerous livelihood, but mining, artisanal small-scale mining particularly, is dangerous. And if we think of things such as the regular bending and twisting, carrying heavy loads, and the lack of formal safety procedures and equipment, this all can negatively impact long-term health outcomes for artisanal small-scale miners. With informal miners as well being near invisible in development activities, as was outlined earlier, it means that, they're often unable to lack access to health services. And this, combined with the poor working conditions and risky lifestyles, means that miners and communities often suffer from high rates of HIV/AIDS, other infectious diseases, including tuberculosis. Next slide, please. So how exactly can formalization help in this area? Well, through formalization, the positive synergies between artisanal and small-scale mining and agriculture can be enhanced further. Targeted health interventions can improve health and safety, access to health services, long-term health outcomes, and even enhance resilience to emerging health threats, such as pandemics like Ebola and currently COVID-19. Formalization activities targeting water use in mining, as well as to build water, sanitation, hygiene, infrastructure for communities also all have clear positive impacts. Next slide, please. The fifth cluster that we grouped some of the SDGs into was around clean energy, infrastructure, and sustainable cities. So a clear positive point is that in terms of energy usage, artisanal small-scale mining is less energy intensive than large-scale mining, at least anecdotally. So as we are quite clear in the report, obviously artisanal small-scale mining, and especially small-scale mining operations, do use lots of energy in the form of diesel used to power generators for machinery, equipment, air pumps, etc. But additional impacts that ASM provides is the locally made construction materials. These can be used for big infrastructure in cities such as roads. And small-scale mining companies, you can often find that they will help to maintain roads, build schools, and even health centres in some local communities as part of their local commitments and social license to operate. The sector is also highly innovative, as I'm sure many of us who work in it are aware. And in particular, we can think of this in this way in terms of processing for minerals. It also helps create job, which results in diversification of these communities and can provide much needed income for people to invest in their homes. And in this way, it also helps to reduce urban migration. However, we considered some of the negative impacts in the report. If we think of rush type scenarios in particular, the makeshift camps and the lack of services often leads to very poor housing and living conditions. Next slide, please. So in our report, when we considered what the way that formalization can help in many different ways, one example is through increased revenues for government, which can be used to fund investments in infrastructure. A second way is to actually make the sector itself more attractive to other investments, such as solar mini grids that can be used by miners and the communities as well to provide sustainable energy sources. Small-scale mining can also help to further catalyze and scale up innovations throughout the sector and even beyond, making for more sustainable industry and manufacturing. And finally, formalization in this way can help create linkages between production, manufacturing, and construction sectors, again, making for more sustainable cities. Thank you very much, and now back over to Jorden.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, James. So let's briefly speak about peace, justice, and governance. As we can see on the map here on the slides, which overlays ASM workforce estimates with the Fragile States Index, ASM thrives in areas that have been affected by conflicts, are considered as high risks, and are associated with poor governance. SDG 16 is a particularly challenging SDG, consisting of 3 key domains: peace, justice, and strong and inclusive institutions. And informal ASM is well known to be negatively correlated to many of these aspects. For example, ASM is associated with organized crime, with armed conflicts, with terrorism, with human rights abuses, bribery, corruption, and so on. However, even in its informal state, ASM also has a positive impact on these issues. For example, ASM provides marginalized youth and ex-combatants with a viable alternative to joining armed groups and criminal networks. But inclusive formalization processes can really leverage the sector's potential in contributing to long-term peace building and state building processes. For example, as we see with Pact's ITSCI program in the African Great Lakes region, supply chain due diligence mechanisms can help to delink ASM from armed conflict and human rights abuses. Moreover, by professionalizing and legitimizing marginalized livelihoods, formalization can provide women and young men with more meaningful prospects for the future, thereby helping to address important root causes of the outbreaks of violent conflicts. Then as the final cluster of analysis, ASM can forge partnerships for the goals, as encapsulated in SDG 17. As one can tell, merely by considering the diverse range of participants that are attending this webinar today, ASM brings together stakeholders from the public sector, the private sector, and civil society. Moreover, by engaging private partners such as large-scale mining companies, refiners, and industry associations, the sector helps to diversify the global sources of development assistance. Building on this, comprehensive formalization efforts can harness this potential by de-risking ASM and thereby improving the investment climate for public and private partners alike. As such, ASM, and especially ASM formalization, can revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. So to conclude, even in its informal state, ASM makes positive contributions to nearly all 17 SDGs, but it also has negative impacts on most of them. However, by transitioning from an informal to a formal sector and moving from the wheel on the left side of the screen to the one on the right side of the screen, together we can unlock the sector's full sustainable development potential. Indeed, depending on the way it is approached, formalization can help to mitigate many negative impacts and amplify ASM's positive impacts on the SDGs. But this does not happen automatically. In order to realize this potential, formalization efforts need to be planned and implemented with the targeted issues in mind. For example, as James has indicated, in order to achieve certain health outcomes, ASM formalization needs to be approached from a health perspective. Or as Kirsten has said, when discussing environmental stewardship, formalization efforts should adopt an integrated land use management approach. However, adoption of only one such perspectives risks not effectively harnessing the sector's complex interlinkages with the other SDGs and can, in effect, also have adverse impacts on them. For example, if no gender-sensitive human rights-based approaches are adopted, women or other disadvantaged minors could be left behind. So therefore, in order to leverage all the identified linkages, ASM formalization needs to be planned and implemented in an inclusive and comprehensive manner with all 17 SDGs in mind. But how do we go about this? In the final part of the policy assessments, we provide detailed guidance to national policymakers, private partners, and the global community. In short, we provide guidance on developing SDG-sensitive formalization strategies and integrating ASM into national, regional, and global development frameworks. We encourage all participants to consider the recommendations in this report. And finally, I want to underscore that whereas this is a first version of mapping ASM to the SDGs, we welcome any reaction from the participants of this webinar. Indeed, as new information about this incredibly diverse sector becomes available, we really see this as a living document that can and should be updated in the future. And with that, I would like to thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Jorden and the team for this brilliant presentation. And indeed, this effort to map ASM to the Sustainable Development Goals is filling a gap, because you would recall that in 2016, the Columbia Center for Sustainable Development, the UNDP, the World Economic Forum, and the SDSN, it did the initial mapping of mining to the Sustainable Development Goals, the Atlas, which was essentially focused on large-scale mining. And your publication, your work is filling a gap of this important sector in the extractive family, as it were. Your key recommendation here is anchored on the formalization. First, before you start answering my main question, I think the audience would benefit from you trying to explain a little bit better what you mean by formalization. What is formalization? And then I think you would agree with me that formalization, at least in the way I understand it, is really a very challenging task. And you've articulated some of the options and the key principles to achieving it. Do you have any particular example where we've had a successful case of formalization? If you could share that, I think it would help us to understand better how to operationalize your framework. So over to you, Jorden, or anyone in the field.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pedro. I will first, as you have requested, speak a little bit about formalization, then provide a concrete example. So indeed, as you say, formalization is a bit of a loosey concept, but a lot of people having different interpretations of it. I think that an important document by UN Environment from 2012 defines formalization as essentially a process of integrating the ASM sector into the regulatory framework, into society, and into the formal economy. So this is a broad definition. But in 2018, I was actually working as a formal consultant with UNITAR, the UN Institute on Training and Research. And there we developed the Formalization Handbook. And in the Formalization Handbook, we really have been building further on unpacking what formalization actually means. And there we really define it as sort of a process of capacity building, of enabling miners, traders, other people involved in mineral supply chains, of enabling them to comply with national regulations and ultimately to access formal markets. So I will not go too much into the substance, but I think one key consideration, one key concept is what we call the key components of the formalization process. And they are outlined on this slide here. And we identify six key components. The first one being geoprospecting and allocating land. The second one being facilitating miners' organization. The third one being licensing and regulating the ASM sector. The fourth one being organizing the wider supply chain, so also supporting the formalization of traders, financiers, other people involved in the mineral supply chain. The fifth component being facilitating access to finance, assistance, and markets. And this is really a critical aspect of enabling compliance with national regulations and ultimately also facilitating that access to the international market. And then the sixth component is monitoring and enforcing compliance with the national regulations, which is often a big challenge as well. So that's in short a bit of a conceptualization of formalization as represented in the Formalization Handbook. Also, Dr. McQuilken and Gavin Hilson have been working further also conceptualization, the formalization process. And we have sort of adopted those different concepts in this publication, ASM and SDGs. Coming to your question about examples, concrete examples of formalization processes, unfortunately, there aren't many examples of really very comprehensive formalization strategies that have been implemented and that have also been linked to the 17 SDGs and local development priorities. But I can give one small example from Sierra Leone. As a former consultant with UNITAR, I had the privilege of working together with Sierra Leone, particularly Sierra Leone's Environment Protection Agency, together with Mr. Kamara, who is also on this call, where we developed Sierra Leone's National Action Plan for reducing mercury use in artisanal gold mining sector. And as part of that National Action Plan, or in short, the NAP, we also developed a comprehensive ASM formalization strategy, which is linked to different sustainable development priorities at the national level. So maybe I will now pass the floor on to Mr. Kamara, a senior environment officer with Sierra Leone's Environmental Protection Agency, to provide more information about the process that was taken in Sierra Leone.
Yes, Mr. Kamara, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Yes, indeed, I was very fortunate to work with Jorden in developing our National Action Plan. And this National Action Plan, one of the key strategies we identify is formalization of the ASGM sector. In developing this, we organized 2 national engagement meetings with the miners, the community stakeholders, and with the national authorities also in Freetown. In these 2 engagement meetings, we deliberated and tried to identify 10 topmost positive impacts of the ASGM sector and 10 topmost negative impacts of the ASGM sector. But luckily for us, the new government of President Mada Bio, when they came in power, they developed what we call the Midterm National Development Plan. This Midterm National Development Plan contains 8 clusters, and each of these clusters are linked to international benchmarks like the SDGs. Each of them are linked to the SDGs. Other international benchmarks to which the clusters of the Midterm Development Plan was linked is the AU agenda and others. So we found out that after identifying the 10 topmost positive impacts and the 10 topmost negative impacts, each of them, we linked them to the clusters of the Midterm Development Plan and subsequently linked to each SDG goal. So this is how we developed the strategy. And as I'm speaking, we are now in the process of trying to implement this plan. Thankful to international partners like GIZ who are coming on board, and other partners are coming on board to implement the formalization strategy for the ASGM sector. So in short, this is how we are able to develop the NAP, the formalization strategies, and how we linked each of the identified positive and negative impacts to the SDGs through the Midterm Development Plan. Because the Midterm Development Plan that we use nationally for our developmental activities.
Thank you very much for your offer. But let me abuse my role as moderator. And before we have 13 or so questions here, which we'll try and give you an opportunity to answer. But you say after for example, the International Conference on Artisanal Small-Scale Mining and Quarrying, which was held in Livingstone, Zambia, which adopted this Mose Watundia Declaration on Artisanal Small-Scale Mining. After the Yaoundé Vision on Artisanal Small-Scale Mining of 2002, and after all the work of the CASMA, the Communities in Artisanal Small-Scale Mining, which the World Bank used to house, and do you have any concrete examples where indeed we have managed to break the poverty trap. Because one of the characterizations of ASM is that it's a poverty-driven activity, which in some cases, of course, has also facilitated poverty alleviation. And in your report, in your study, you're arguing quite strongly that in localized settings, this has contributed to improving the livelihoods with localized multiplier effects, linkages, and so on and so forth. But is this a pattern that we are witnessing across jurisdictions? Are we romanticizing artisanal small-scale mining? If you, I mean, any of you in this block, if you could address this fundamental question, I think as we enable the other participants to also voice their views about this. I mean, I mean, whoever wants to pick this one, very, very pointed response so that it educates the audience about your own perceptions about whether the needle has changed or otherwise, we are still in the same paradigm. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. As you rightly said, indeed, ASM is a poverty alleviation issues. For now, we, as I said earlier, we just started the process of implementation. So I cannot give you a concrete example as whether we have achieved a positive change or not at this stage in time. But frankly speaking, as you rightly said, it's a poverty alleviation issue, and these issues are so many. When we are doing the research, they came out clearly. Okay, so via the our national action plan is gearing towards that to solve this issue of poverty alleviation, and that is our goal. At the end of the day, that is the result we are looking at.
Jorden, do you want to complement what Mr. Kamara has just shared with us?
Definitely. No, it's a really critical question. And indeed, some miners get stuck in poverty traps. Some people stay mining. Some people go into mining in order to raise funds, to pursue other avenues, to pursue education. It's true that in many cases it is difficult, especially in the sector's informality and with its lack of sort of tangible assistance. It's difficult for many miners to really transition, for example, to other livelihoods. At the same time, in fieldwork that I've been doing, and I'm sure that Dr. James McQuilken and Kirsten Dales in their own professional and personal experiences can share some experience as well. But for example, when Mr. Kamara and I we've been doing a tour throughout Sierra Leone, visiting different mining communities, and we have spoken with artisanal gold miners who have, for example, shared that artisanal gold mining has enabled them to raise enough funds to either to start a new business. Or to pursue education at the university level, for example. And here in Western Kenya, we have heard some similar accounts as well. So on the nationwide level, I find it difficult to answer the question, because so far I don't think any country has realized to formalize the sector. And I think it's maybe not even feasible to formalize the entire sector, but parts of the sector can be formalized and further developed, and that process in itself is already very important. So that's in short my answer to it. I don't know if James or Kirsten, if one of you would like to complement as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So I think, like, taking a step back, the informal sector itself worldwide employs about 2 billion people according to ILO. So informality as itself is not just confined to artisanal small-scale mining. And I think we have to remember that in our conversation. I think also, as we all know on the line, formalization itself, and as I think has already been said, is quite a woolly concept, or at least it means different things to different people, and it has different parts, and it's made up of lots of different parts that are needed, and it's a process. Say, Mr. Pedro, there's many people, including yourselves and others on the line, who have been working in this space for 20, 30, 40 years to try and address this issue of formalization. I think in terms of your other question around, are we on the cusp of change? I think maybe what our publication is useful, and certainly reflects a lot of the other conversation in the literature and with other stakeholders who are seeing this, is that it provides a framework to further promote artisanal and small-scale mining, to further bring it to the attention of policymakers. And I think maybe in the last 5 to 10 years, and certainly more recently with better data through initiatives such as DELF that I'm also involved in, and Pact and the World Bank. And again, through publication and through mapping it to these global frameworks, we can really show the importance of ASM, and in that way engage more money, more funds, let's be honest, to engage with these communities and provide long-term type development that ranges from everything from education, processing, right up to getting geological land and licenses and access. So that's my view of formalization, and that's where I see it. We're on this cusp here, and by tying it to global frameworks, that's how we help to move forwards gradually as a collective group.
Thank you. Let me pick up questions from the floor. Here, José Carlos de Pierola, it's a great question here. And I'll pick 3 or so, and then, amongst yourself, you may then decide how you want to respond to them. The first one from José is, what are the incentives you've identified in the field for formalization? Then another interesting one is organizing the supply chain along the path of formalization is the most challenging in my estimation. How can this be carried out best? Especially because, as you know, some of the preoccupation on ASM issues have to do with the securitization of supply. So issues with child labor and so on and so forth, but yet the value chain is much deeper than that. So if you could look at that beyond just the supply chain issues and then address the real problem and the incentives and otherwise for people to go and try and travel to try and get their license also formalized, if any, when sometimes you're talking hundreds and so kilometers that they have to go to the village, to the main centers. Then, how likely, this is from Vernon Underwood, how likely are governments to buy into formalization as part of their development strategy, when we are also witnessing, as we are speaking now, some governments going back to the old practice of trying to send in security forces and so on to try and arrest the problem. So those 3 questions, I think, would be enough for now. If you can quickly just respond to this, then some of these issues will then come back to them later. So in whatever order you want to answer, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, maybe what I will do, Mr. Pedro, is I will give an answer to the first and the third question, and then maybe pass to my co-authors to weigh in those questions, and also on the second question. I think many of these questions are really interrelated. Really great questions. Thanks a lot, everyone. Starting with the third questions, are governments really going to buy into formalization? That's a key question. Indeed, we see that many governments are prioritizing the large-scale mining sector because it can much more easily bring rents into the government, can be much more easily taxed. At the same time, I think that, because the sector's informality, we're still in the process of understanding the sector better, collecting more information about the sector's impacts. And it's critical and important for sustainable development issues. And that's really what we try to do with this kind of publication, is that we demonstrate how critical the sector it is for sustainable development at the national and at the local and at the global level. And I think that as we are still exploring, so even with this publication, we have not yet mapped all the possible linkages that are there, because we're still learning about the sector and the diverse minerals that are being mined by it. So I think that we see in many countries, we see sort of a bit of a swing of the pendulum, some countries going more to embracing formalization now. To give an example, in Sierra Leone, Mr. Kamara knows that the medium-term national development plan that Mr. Kamara made reference to, ASM formalization has now been included as a policy priority, and that in the national development plan. So I think that's really a great example. And we see more and more countries, doing similar things as well. At the same time, we see countries indeed going the other way, taking top-down approaches, banning the sector temporarily and things like that. So it is difficult, but I think that what we need to do essentially for formalization is a process where all the different stakeholders are involved, from the government to miners to international buyers to traders, etc., local communities. I think that formalization, if addressed comprehensively, can provide benefits for everyone. because for the government, it can bring great taxes and royalties, great revenues from the government. It can enhance the sector's impact to GDP, and also it can gain foreign exchange influx. So I think that as these things are presented in a more compelling manner, that governments are more and more now realizing how important formalization is. And that I think relates to the first question as well. What are the incentives for formalization? Of course, that really depends on the way that formalization is implemented. And unfortunately, many countries are still taking a bit more of a legalist approach, where they're focusing more on licensing and less so on providing technical assistance and findings for enabling that compliance with national regulations. So I think that formalization, if addressed comprehensively, can provide great benefits by facilitating access to equipment, access to finance, access to training, facilitating the organization of miners, giving them a voice, representing them at the regional and at the national and at the global level. It can provide many, many benefits. But this really depends on the way that it is implemented and also the way that we see formalization. And to that end, we also, with this publication and our conceptualization of formalization, we try to reframe the question and reframe the conceptualization of formalization. Because ultimately, formalization is really what we make it as a global community. I don't know if perhaps any Kamara, McQuilken, or Dales would like to weigh in as well on those questions, and otherwise the second question.
I'll let someone else speak, because I've spoken already, but otherwise, yes, I can.
I would weigh in just briefly. I think that if we take a step back and we think about formalization, yes, informal economies drive rural communities the world over, but also it's important to ask who benefits from informality. And often it's not the artisanal miners, it's many nefarious actors, illicit pre-financiers, and illegitimate partners. So from that perspective, sure, you could avoid formalization, but who are you really benefiting? You're propagating elite benefit capture. And also just one item to identify is when we talk about who we're assisting, whether it's through supply chain organization or formalization, it's incredibly important to realize artisanal miners are very different than small scale operators. So if we think about the most vulnerable within the supply chain is that often it's the artisanal miners that have the least power. So if we think from that perspective, there are many incentives for formalization. It is a process, not a product, but you have to ask yourself, what are the risks of not pursuing
it? Thank you. I think this dimension of the need to profile the ASM sector and the political economy dimension of it is absolutely important. So we are now transiting to the large scale mining sector, and the publication titled Mining and SDGs, 2020 Status Update. Earlier, I had made reference to the Mapping Mining to the Sustainable Development Goals Atlas. And I think it is important a couple of years after this to ask ourselves where we are in terms of incorporating the SDGs into the business practices of our companies and else. So this presentation hopefully will help us to address that question. I mean, in his book, Mountain Movers, Mining, Sustainability, and Agents of Change, Daniel Franks said that mining has a checkered past. I mean, to Hélène and Perrine, the question then, which we would like you to answer through your presentation is indeed whether through your responsible mining index and of course this mapping exercise, whether we are seeing progress or not. So this is a little bit the intro to you. I would like to invite therefore Hélène Piaget from Responsible Mining Foundation and Perrine Toledano from the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment to take the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio. That's a really lovely introduction and a welcome into the conversation. And we're very pleased you also mentioned the publication of the Atlas in 2016 back to for a while. It's also, I do want to express our pleasure to be sharing the panel with speaking about ASM in the context of the SDGs, because really the two live side by side so often, seldom seen in the same context. So this is a really remarkable panel. I'd also like to, what is great it's been to work with the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, and particularly with Perrine and her team. And as you may have heard from the beginning, first presentation, when Antonio introduced us, I'm speaking on behalf of my colleague, McQuilken. Unfortunately, she can't be with us, but she's really led this study from the side of the Responsible Mining Foundation. And then I'd also like to just apologize to our friends in Asia and colleagues in Asia who've asked and said, oh my, this is really late at night. So that's just to let people know we're aware of you. Apologies for the time. It's hard to get around the globe, and we'll be recording this and putting it on various websites. Jackson join us. He's somebody with so many years experience, deep experience in mining and thinking about the SDGs, the role of mining in society. And we really look forward to his words as well, as an actual practitioner and not looking on the outside. So the Responsible Mining Foundation publishes a report, the Report 2020. We do this biannually, and we look at the large number of large-scale mining companies along issues of ESG and economic development. All of those issues that we look at map very well to the sustainable development. And in fact, as many of you know, mining is one of the industries that actually maps to all of the sustainable development goals. Just stopping on the SDGs for a moment, we find that the SDGs is a very framework for engaging people in all parts of the world around conversations of responsible mining. Even in part of the world where there's reference to talking about the social part of ESG, we even find there that one thing people around the world tend to have great agreement on, certainly on the principles behind having the sustainable development goals. So they're a really good entry point into conversation. Beyond that, of course, mining has a great opportunity to contribute because it's so essential to daily life and so plays such a big part of the economy. So we use this study, and here you can see the scope of a wide geographic distribution. We looked at 38 large-scale mining companies, and these included listed and state-owned and companies as well. We used this data in order to do the research that we'll be sharing with you. One of the findings we had in the RMI report 2020 is that we see there's a risk of SDG washing. And why do we see that? So one of the reasons is that we see selective reporting where companies are mentioning and selecting the icons, particularly because we always see the icons in the sustainability reports, but those SDGs where they make a good contribution, and sees this in terms of things like education. But mining impacts where it operates. You can't have a mining operation without some impact on water in education. Missing is that there's no mention that we could find ever of the negative impacts of mining or the connected to the SDGs. So there are impacts of mining that could be working against the arrival or the end of the SDGs. We think it would be good to see a more collective, more systemic picture of both the good and the risks that are involved, where there could be some impediment to the achievement of the SDGs. So what Antonio Pedro mentioned, we had the publication in 2016 of this very useful mining to the Sustainable Development Goals. And this has been a really good reference in the last few years in engaging and mining. And being the 10 years to 2030, we also thought this is a good to so what is the status, and can we help encourage further improved performance and mining companies to take up the opportunities to identify them, to communicate about them, but also to at the same time look at where the risks are and work around monitoring and mitigating those. So the status update, we call it the Mining and the SDGs, a 2020 status update. I worked with the objectives. We've tried to present a true picture and the opportunities in terms of mining, supporting the achievement of the SDGs. We try to look for general trends, for leading practices, and also to identify opportunities for improvement. And lastly, what we've added, which wasn't included, is to look at risks that one might want to avoid. We'd also like to say, before we get into the key results, why does it matter if we might have greenwashing? And we think this is really important for both the mining industry and also for the status of the SDGs. So we think it's bad mining industry if they seem to be all of SDG washing, because we think it's a wonderful opportunity to build trust and show how important mining is in the global economy. On the other side, we think that the stature and power of the SDGs are really important in most of these discussions. And so it's really, one also doesn't want to see harm done to the status and stature of the SDGs. So, key results. In terms of an overall trend, we see two. And the one is that leading practices by some companies on some of the SDGs. And the ones you see here on the screen are the ones where we have found practices. That said, though, just be aware that this is not necessarily that one finds it in broad application. So, for example, life below water, we only find one of the 38 companies that actually not to dump and dispose waste into riverine, lake, and marine environments. But we did see that, we did find that. And then the other overall trend is we think that there's really much more work needs to be done in terms of finding evidence that of what's happening as well. So there are some gaps in materiality and action. Many companies are identifying, looking at where they material interest for them in terms of the SDGs, but there are also gaps. And so 3 SDGs quite plainly look good on paper. They're identified as material and important, but on the end, they're weak on action. And we're going to show you some of the results and why we say that. So if one the SDG 3 in terms of good health and well-being, and bearing in mind that the full description is for healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages, we noticed that companies, their responsiveness to this SDG in terms of their occupational safety and health policies and practices is good in the mining industry. However, in a sense, that belongs part of SDG 8 in terms of work. But the piece that's missing here is looking at the well-being for all at all ages. And so it's really remarkable that we find a really low responsiveness from companies in terms of looking at the impacts of their activities on community health. This is really hard to find. Even though one does see that there's a lot, quite frequently, one sees reports of supporting facility personnel, but really little in terms of looking at the impacts on the mining community around them. And in fact, we found of these 38 companies, 22 companies scored 0 on that. Companies actually showing some evidence of trying to track their impacts on the health of those around the operation. In terms of gender equality, SDG 5, to read for us the full description for this SDG, which is achieve gender equality and empower all women, all girls. And here we're well aware that, as you can see, the results don't look very interesting. And it us, given how gender is such an important trending topic. Gender spoken about a lot, it's mentioned a lot. One can't have panels without women on these days. Everybody's aware of gender, and yet it's really hard to find evidence of action to ensure gender equality and look at impacts mining on women. So we find in our indicators that, for example, look at impact assessment of the impacts of mining on women in local communities, we find really nothing. And other things that are important, like PPE, protective equipment that's appropriate. This is also something that very few companies can show that they're paying attention to. However, we do see, we dismiss, that there's far more attention to and some movement on gender representation at the board or in the digital. And so it's something where we think there's a great opportunity for lots of improvement and hard to do. Let's look at clean water and sanitation. And for G6, full terminology is to ensure access to water and sanitation for all. And again, interesting is that we see companies generally spend a lot of attention around how well they're using water, how efficiently they're using water in terms of quality. We see very little being published in terms of their care for water quality. And of course, both of those are really important in terms of the others, if we say water and sanitation for all, for the others that are affected around the mining operation. And similarly, we have implementation of designing water stewardship and such strategy in combination with other waters. So we think this again is an opportunity where a lot can be done. Mining companies are very well resourced, clever engineers, lots of technology, but it may be a question of making sure that there's communication all around the mine operations. So the document that we've produced includes a lot of examples of both opportunity and so risks to look out for. And I'm going to hand you over now to Perrine Toledano to talk about the recommendations and looking at. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Hélène. Thanks a lot, Pedro, and all partners on this call. So for the recommendations, I only have a couple of minutes, so I will be brief, but I invite you to check our reports, obviously, to get the broad view of all the recommendations. So the first recommendations, integrate the SDGs into core ESG and business management. Indeed, SDGs are no more a peripheral framework to map activities and revenues against, as companies have been doing. SDGs should guide the business strategy and corporate governance. Next slide, please. Set targets that are ambitious, progressive, and measurable. Too often, the SDGs are seen as a menu of options, whereas they actually provide an ambitious target framework as well as the basis for a strong M&E framework to track progress to 2030 and beyond. Next slide, please. Apply consistently across operations. So mining operations can do very good things, but most often these things are not systematized across operations in mine sites, even within the company. It represents a huge missed opportunity, and at IMF and CCSI, we regularly highlight this in our report. Next slide, please. Disclose all public interest data on SDGs linked activities. This data relate to the actions taken related to the SDGs, the data on negative impacts, and explanations of mitigation measures and system in place, as well as the results of the performance monitoring efforts. Maybe that point addresses partly one of the questions that I'm seeing on the Q&A. Last slide, please. Use the momentum of the SDG decade of action to enable change. Indeed, as you know, we only have 10 years left to achieve the SDGs, and by some estimates, we are 62 years behind schedule. Thank you very much, and I'm handing over again. Oh, sorry. I'm turning over to Brian to talk through his corporate experience on SDG integration. Brian?
Hello. Yeah, firstly, thank you very much for having me on the session. I'm going to start off with a disclaimer. Whilst I have worked with industry for a long time within AngloGold Ashanti, I'm not a voice of industry, nor am I representing the company or the industry. But having said that, I do have some insights, and embedding the SDGs into business strategy and into the principles of sustainable development into practice is not easy. It's necessary. Mining is a primary industry, and as such impacts positively and negatively across the spectrum of sustainable development and the SDGs. As we've seen with the artisanal and small-scale miners research, this broad influence and applicability is relevant to large-scale mining too. Also in the competitive landscape of the future, it's my view that the sustainable company of the future is the one that embeds sustainable development into its core. Its products, its services, its business practices, and the way in which it is experienced by stakeholders in a positive and authentic way. Turning this into reality requires an intentional and transformational approach, where the company revisits its business philosophies and reimagines itself as an integral part of society with higher order goals, which are congruent with both business success and societal success. And I don't think that it's possible for us to divorce those going into the future. And in my experience within the industry, I think that this is probably the biggest challenge. However, in its absence, engaging with sustainability will be transactional, and there will be a high risk of SDG washing. An intentional embedding of the sustainable development goals and sustainability into the fabric of the business is also a challenge. The traditional and commonly used planning and analytical approach to strategy formulation is not particularly well placed to deal with the complexities that are inherent to sustainable development. In the transactional approach, there is a mapping of the sustainable development goals to existing practices and activities. And effectively, there's nothing new to change the game. There's nothing that shifts the game. And we remain the same, okay? It's also limited by certain organizational constraints, such as short-termism, such as the business's selected priorities. Now, in our experience with AngloGold Ashanti, we used a design thinking approach, which considered the challenges that the business faces as it interfaces with society, establishing a higher order set of goals that are relevant to both the business and to society, coming up with an approach and a game plan to translate that philosophy into practices and developing a coherent set of actions. Okay. This translation of intent and philosophy into practices and experiences on the ground, as with any change program, is difficult. Essentially, to be authentic, it must represent a broad organizational change program. It doesn't happen by chance and requires a dedicated lead agent working with a host of change agents across and through the business. And this lead change agent needs to have a voice that is heard and is considered at a board and executive level. The lead change agent focuses on design and supporting the translation, which is in effect a combination of integrated thinking, integrated doing, and ultimately integrated reporting. the lead change agent, as long as the other change agents need to progressively build their credibility, particularly at an operational level, so that they can influence work and practices at an operational level where the company is experienced by society, both good and bad. And in doing so, reduce the lag. And I mean, particularly in large companies, there's inevitably a big lag between philosophy, intent, and strategy and translation to what happens on the ground. And I think that's been particularly evident in the findings of the Responsible Mining Index. Okay. At that point, I think I've said a lot of things in a very short space of time, and I think it would be better just to stop there and be open for questions with the panel.
Okay, thank you very much to Hélène, Perrine, and Brian for introducing the report and also articulating some of its key findings and recommendations. I think there is something that I've heard all of you mentioning, the SDG washing. There is a very interesting article by Danny Roderick, which is titled "The Public's Business." It's from 13th of October 2020, where he basically discusses what he calls the Friedman doctrine of profit maximization. And I think I want to pick a little bit of that concept to go down to the tensions that sometimes mining companies are confronted with. And Brian, you've made a little bit reference to that. When commodity prices go down, and when, of course, the bottom line issues become more critical, sometimes we see companies focusing mostly on those bottom line issues. And the departments that are responsible for environmental and social, let's say, agenda are those the first ones to be slashed down. So your views about that, and perhaps who are the front runners in integrating the SDGs into their business models? If you could, from your own assessment, provide some light on that. Because there are also some critics there that say that environmental, social, and governance factors reporting, so the ESG that you made reference to, again, is not taken very, very seriously. And we don't have incentives to push change. So if you could basically say whether we have made a transition from the profit maximization imperative of Milton Friedman's, the Friedman doctrine, into really adopting this, the SDGs, incorporating in this business. This is what I want to hear from you, just some, let's say, some pointers, and then of course we'll entertain the conversations of the audience. I don't know who wants to pick that one. Brian, I see you are anxious to step in, and then Hélène.
You know, looking at it from the inside, and I've been out of the industry closely for about 18 months, but I don't think that there has been that fundamental transition. Okay, and I mentioned at the outset of my talk that the most difficult part at the outset is for the enterprise to reimagine itself as an integral part of society. Okay? Because unless it does that, it is going to be looking at its work in relation to the short-termism and the profits and the maximizing profits. Okay? Whereas if it sees itself, and this is at a leadership and executive level, in a particularly authentic way, if it inherently believes that it is an organizer of society that must contribute to the positive evolution of that society, then we're playing a different game, a fundamentally different game. Of course, being profitable is necessary, because in the absence of profitability, you are unable to contribute, and you cease to exist. Okay? However, if that is the primary driver, and Peter Drucker mentioned this in the 1950s when he spoke about the purpose of the business, okay? It is the primary purpose of the business should not be to maximize profits, because that's unsustainable. It is a requirement of the business, but not its purpose. Its purpose should be to be an organ of society.
Very interesting and very deep. Hélène, your views?
As you, Brian, you've really plumbed to the heart, the absolute heart of it. But what we do find is we do think that the lens that companies bring, but also the lens that governments bring to the activity of mining, and in terms of seeing the role you can play and why you're given that space by society. So what we do see is two things that's true, exactly what you said, Antonio, that so often when there's some kind of, and we know that mining is cyclical, as soon as the cycle goes a little bit down, then we just immediately have that sustainability departments are being slashed and there's less people and so on, which is very much short-term thinking, and we think that it's not that helpful. Even in very big companies, the sustainability departments usually complain how small they are, how under-resourced they are. So I think that everything to do with supporting the SDGs should be properly resourced, and money and people behind making it happen and being able to report on it. The other thing is that we've got developing country governments who tell us that they feel that there are times where they're asked to make sacrifices to lower tax rates or whatever, but when the going is good, one doesn't see the reverse. It really speaks again to what you've said, Brian, about seeing oneself as a player in society and allowing others to hold expectations.
Thank you. Perrine, do you want to step in here? Perhaps I've asked for, some indication of whether there are front runners there, and just to provide a bridge to our joint conversation between ASM and the large small-scale mining. Often when we discuss these issues, we focus essentially on those two polars, the ASM and the large-scale operators, and yet in the middle you have the juniors who are also confronted with some of the issues that the small and medium-scale companies are confronted with, the inability to respond to some of these requirements. And so your views about that, just as a transition to a joint conversation. Perrine?
So Pedro, the question is about the role of the juniors that are taking all the risk in between ASM and the LSM?
Yes, so we've mapped the role of large-scale operators in achieving the SDGs. We've also done the same for artisanal small-scale mining, thanks to the work of Pact in Delaware. Now the issue is, in between there's a very large body of companies that are struggling with some of these issues. Can you just comment that as we try now to transit to the conversation between, this relationship between large and small scale mining, and of course address some of the questions in the Q&A. Yeah.
So often the publicly listed company, large scale companies that are publicly listed, they say that, the light shouldn't be on them, but on the small players that act behind the scene and that do a lot of harms. And most often they are not publicly listed, so they are not subject to disclosure requirements and external oversight. That's basically true, and that's a problem. That's a little bit the elephant in the room, and it sounds like it can only work if the large scale companies that at the end often what they do is I mean, what the juniors do is that they flip the license to the large-scale companies. So these large-scale companies are a little bit the buyers and the client. They have a specific, they have a special leverage on these junior companies. They could really impose the sustainability standards instead of buying any possible license and inheriting from the liabilities of the juniors. And I've never seen such discussions on this, and to what extent the large-scale companies could actually impose their leverage on the more junior ones.
Okay, so I think we have some room for more research on this topic. Let me at this stage invite everyone, and please let me thank you for your insights, both the first group that spoke on ASM issues and of course our last three speakers. And now I would like to explore the collaboration that could perhaps be fostered between large-scale and small-scale mining. And then hear your perspectives about that. Because in some jurisdictions, they live in the same spaces, and in some cases, this can lead to tensions. In other places, we've seen very good examples of collaboration. If you could elucidate a little bit this issue with some practical examples of what you're seeing from the ground, and then also articulate a little bit what could be done better with a view to improving the coexistence, which I said in some cases part of the same ecosystem. So what are the issues? What are the opportunities? Who is doing a good job that we can sort of replicate in other jurisdictions? That's the question. I mean, absolutely no order in this. I mean, whoever wants to pick it first, then jump in. James, I see you are very anxious there. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, it's a really interesting question and nexus. So I think that, first of all, one example, perhaps starting with an example from Pact, from some of our own work, is the Matoshi cobalt mine in Kolwezi in DRC, which is a pilot model that Pact is engaged with supporting, whereby the mine owner, Chemaf, the license holder, is actually allowing artisanal workers in the form of a cooperative comiacol to work on the concession and mine cobalt. And the reason they're allowed to do that is first of all, there's some training that's provided, some education on health and safety standards. The removal of overburden is also undertaken by the company, and to ensure that miners are working above ground safely. And also there's other health and safety measures going on and longer term training. And the benefits we see is that this has created a level of peace amongst the local community, which has obvious benefits for the miners as well as the mining company. And it enables responsible sourcing and responsible production. Yeah, and I think these types of relationships, these types of models, where the conditions are right, can be very powerful and very useful to enable artisanal miners to become legitimate and to also, earn from minerals from their own countries that are rightfully theirs. I think one more thing I would say is going back to kind of the earlier question around the role of juniors as well. Artisanal miners are often the pathfinders. They find the minerals, and then a junior shows up, and then eventually, after the license is flipped over and over, a large-scale company will take it over. And I think there is a really important role to play. And I think it comes down, from my personal point of view and from some of my own research, and I know others are doing, is this issue of trust and relationships. So if your junior is one of the first ones there, or whoever's there, and they're building up a level of trust with the community, they make some promises and then disappear, this can have real negative impacts for future engagements with that community. So in that way, I think it's the role of government, as well as those on the local government who are interacting with the communities, to be the ones that are building the trust of the communities and navigating and managing juniors, large-scale mining companies, to ensure that they become the kind of mediator within this as well, and they're able to provide a continuous voice and a continuous force for good in that area.
Okay, thank you very much. So Hélène, in 1 minute, can you try and offer your own perspective on this? Because Pierre is already saying, I mean, we've gone beyond the allocated time.
Okay, thank you, Antonio. So I think perhaps just to go back to the response to the RMI report 2020, we do look at the interface between large-scale mining and ASM, and the results are very encouraging. Again, very few companies show an inclination to be neighbors, to get involved in identifying or engaging with ASM miners in their neighborhood. And we think that, you know, the word neighborliness mine, because it's so obvious. If you're sharing water sources, you're on the boundary with one another, identifying, recognizing one another, and creating some order just to start with is already really helpful. And that being said, also want to remind the audience that not all mining companies do have ASM neighbors. So it's not a general thing for all companies, but we see very little evidence of companies getting involved. The other thing we often hear from companies is that they tell us it's not our job. It's not our job, it's the government's. Governments must sort them out. And very often the accusation of illegal mining, which is the case to jurisdiction, but I think one needs to be very careful of not very quickly identifying people as illegal and therefore not engaging. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, as Perrine said, Jorden, do you want to, and Perrine 1 minute each, and of course Brian, one each?
Okay, so I'll come first. Very quickly, I was reviewing the interesting case studies of LSM, ASM synergies this week, and I saw a case that reminded me of our work on shared use of infrastructure that Pedro, you know well. And one of the things, maybe Brian can speak to this example. There is Anglo Ashanti working in this mine in Colombia called I think, Gramalote, where in addition to employing ASM workers, providing training and so on, the company shares the processing capacity for the minerals with artisanal miners. So they are not pushed to using environmentally and difficult methods that are also difficult for health. So and for the mine, it just means taking advantage of the economies of scale, and obviously I'm sure they're doing it at a very low marginal cost. Just wanted to report this case study.
Thank you.
Yeah, look,
yes, Brian, yes, your minute.
I think that there are a raft of opportunities for living and working in harmony between artisanal small-scale miners and large-scale miners, right? And certainly, working and living in harmony does not really include putting a fence around the operations and then presuming that you'll be totally separate from them, because they will inherently, particularly if it's not formalized, be interfaces, and those interfaces are more likely to be conflict-driven rather than collaborative-driven. So my perspective is in the interest of the mining company to work with artisanal and small-scale miners, particularly those within a legitimate framework, because it is very difficult to work with those that are not in a legitimate framework. Okay. Now the opportunities go beyond the use of existing capability within the mine, as you've actually mentioned. I mean, there are opportunities that Anglo Gold Ashanti considered whilst I was there of looking at mine land that wasn't being utilized or planned for exploration by the main mining company, but was within their tenement, and seeing, well, how could we actually work together so that this particular land is actually allocated to these these artisanal and small-scale miners. There's also the transfer of knowledge, the transfer of skills, the introduction of new technologies that will enable them to be more efficient in their processes and to reduce their impact. So the raft of opportunities for collaboration are vast, and I think are in the interest of the company itself. Okay, they are also lined up with the African Mining Initiative and the African Mining Vision that recognizes the legitimacy of artisanal and small-scale miners as a big part of the wealth production or value creation within an African continent, at least. Okay.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian. Kirsten, 1 minute. Kirsten, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, my mute wouldn't come off there. Yeah, just in response, I think that considering the very complex landscape that exists between artisanal and small-scale miners and the large-scale mining industry, one of the largest challenges is, of course, overlapping concessions, and that governments often do not make land or provide enough land allocation for ASM activities, nor do they describe the very nuanced nature of subsurface mineral rights versus land rights. And when you have weak property rights and a range of formal and informal influences on land tenure systems, this systematically disadvantages miners at the localist of levels that are artisans and the smallest of scale. And Gramalote in Colombia is one example, but it's certainly not the only one. Often what we've seen, and particularly looking at the largest mining companies, they do have their own internal policies, Newmont, for instance, whereas Barrick chooses not to in the gold mining industry. So it's a corporate decision, and it's really contingent upon the site level, the risk profile, the land use history, and of course, the level of commitment from the government, which is reflected in existing law. So although it's a complex space, we've seen under COVID that in the first time since 1998, poverty is on the rise. So as a poverty-driven sector, artisanal mining will only increase. And I agree, it is in the best interest of the large-scale actors to engage the community.
Thank you, Jorden. 1 minute.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Pedro. Well, I think we heard a lot of great examples already and different entry points in which ASM and LSM can work together for the achievement of the SDGs for both ASM and also for the SDGs. I think there are many different ways, as we heard from James, who was speaking about our Motoshi project in southeastern DRC. There can be ore buying programs where large-scale mining companies buy ore or buy minerals from artisanal small-scale miners. They can facilitate with improving occupational health and safety conditions, transferring technology into the sector, helping artisanal small-scale miners to improve their environmental footprint and also their production levels. And ultimately, they can facilitate the access to formal markets and the wider formalization process. So I think it's really important and pragmatic to take this approach of facilitating ASM, LSM coexistence. But of course, as I think that has become obvious from our presentation on ASM, the ASM sector also needs to be approached and formalized in its own rights. And there are different ways in which that can be done. At Pact, we really take a market-based approach to ASM formalization, and we work not only with large-scale mining companies, but also with international mineral buyers. And I think that's really critical, getting international, smelters, refiners, jewelers, getting international buyers to buy ASM minerals to improve, to facilitate their access to minerals, but also to improve their corporate social responsibility and their own contributions to the SDGs. Maybe on a final note, I will say, as we have now started exploring the different interlinkages between ASM and the SDGs, which we definitely need to continue doing, I think it's now up to us as a global community and all the different stakeholders that are on this webinar. It's now up to us to start leveraging these opportunities. And even though our time has been limited, I think it's critical, and I really urge all participants on this webinar to read both reports from the Responsible Mining Foundation, the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, and the report by Pact and University of Delaware, and also really consider our recommendation for furthering these linkages between mining and SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I don't know whether the camera is still, the camera is around, but anyway, I think we're pressed with time now. As you said, it is very difficult in 1.5 or a little bit more hours to go deep into everything that is in your reports. This session was meant to introduce the reports to the larger audience, pointing to some very important messages. I think our last conversations here indicated that coexistence between large and small scale mining can happen, but it has to be carefully managed so that we do not exacerbate existing tensions and problems. I think we should not leave this session thinking we should leave this session recognizing the important role that mining plays and will continue to play to generate social value, economic impact, and so on and so forth. Whilst we recognize there are some issues like reference to SDG washing and so on and so forth, I think it's appropriate for us also to recognize the valid contribution of mining to the achievement of some of the SDGs. I think both reports from a large scale and ASM perspective has recognized that mining can contribute to SDG 1 and so on and so forth. Yet there are still many issues to be addressed. In some jurisdictions, like in Africa, for example, mining is still an enclave industry. How to reconcile the profit maximization agenda with the need to deepen local content and so on and so forth. Those are some of the issues that require spaces for dialogue so that we minimize the divergence in what constitutes value. I think shared value initiative, I think, offers some guidance about how we can do that. And I mean, in the good old days, Hélène, I think our work on the minerals value management framework with WEF, I think provided some guidance also on how to bridge those differences. But my job, as I said, was just to try and facilitate this important conversation. I think your reports provide guidance on how we can proceed and how we can continue the conversation at different levels. This is a joint responsibility, both of governments and private sector, civil society, and we as citizens, and of course, consumers, institutional investors, and so on. I think my impression, I mean, if I was Luke Danielson, 20 years or so after his seminar work and breaking new ground, I would say that mining has made a tremendous contribution to the discourse of sustainable development, but there's still quite some room to cover. And I think together we will certainly be able to do that. The opportunities are there. Building back better requires mining. And I think if we can do it well, we will be recognized much more. So thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. And look forward to more of these conversations in other settings. Thank you.